So it sort of struggles up to Mach 1.2, and then away you go. And I just remember going very quickly up to Mach 2. So you're screaming along, and the ground's going like 7 miles a minute. I went up to about 60,000 feet to slow down a bit so I could bring the power back. As I sort of got there, my first warning light came on for the fuel. I got Steve Murray, actually from Africa originally, 6th generation African. So that's stuff from our maternal side. My family moved out there from my mother's side in the 1830s with the potato famine in Ireland, as I believe it, and also from Germany. And they moved out to southeast the Cape. And probably in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, the family moved up to, which was then Rhodesia at that stage. And I was brought up in a farm in the eastern side of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, a huge farm. It was for Africa standard, 32,000 acres. And my father was the cattle manager on the farm. And it was a lovely life. We had a very wealthy farmer, and we had something like 9 families on the farm, working on all diverse, from everything from cattle to tobacco to racehorses, and right the way through. Anyway, while I was growing up there, the farmer had a light aircraft that he used to fly, sometimes take my mum to town and go shopping, and it was a little Bonanza, those detailed Bonanzas. And also while on the farm, we had a lot of, this is after, must have been, 10 years after the Second World War, we had a lot of British jets coming out to Africa and flying low over the farm. And I believe one of my first words was upper, or ndegi, which is the African word for aeroplane. So at that stage, I was starting to be very keen on becoming a pilot. I remember telling my folks, obviously telling them that. I then went to school, to a boarding school for the first 5 years of my life.
At what age did you go there? How old were you when you went there?
7 years old. My mother homeschooled us for the first year, and then I went there. She wasn't really keen on the farm. I think she was more of a city girl. So when I went into my last year of junior school, we moved into, which was then, now Harare, was then Salisbury. We lived in town. My father then started working for a cattle company, traveling around Rhodesia, buying and selling cattle for a big company. And I went to school in Salisbury, senior school. And once again, as we mentioned earlier, my grades didn't quite equate to my enthusiasm. But when I turned 15, which I was in probably, when I turned 15, we had these Hawker Hunters that arrived. They were a British aircraft and the state of the art at the time, and they arrived in Rhodesia. And that I was pretty keen on jets, obviously, at that stage, and that's the aircraft I wanted to fly, which I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do.
And that was from age 15. You had that in, you just...
I was keen on flying before that. In fact, I had a canoe, which I had saved up and bought. It was very basic canoe, but I remember I started painting at that stage. I painted a Spitfire on the side, and I called it Spitfire. So I was obviously keen on aeroplanes from an early age. But at 15, when the jets arrived, that's when I wanted to fly. So it was an early age. And so, I got to my sort of matric level. I didn't do very well, and I didn't have high enough grades to apply for pilot training. So a good friend of mine, I've been right through school with him. He was going to join as an instrument technician. That's what he wanted to do. So I had enough grades to do that, so I thought I'd join with him. And it was a really good idea. At the time, it wasn't sort of obviously what I wanted, but it was a good grounding for the Air Force for me, because I went in as just a technician, and I had a wonderful time. We lived in a fighter base right in the middle of Rhodesia. Excuse me. Right in the middle of the country. And the only aircraft I really worked on was the Hawker Hunter. So I spent my lives climbing over this aeroplane, and because I was instrument fitter, there wasn't an awful lot of work for us to do. So I spent my time helping out with engines, and we only 24 technicians on the squadron with 12 aircraft. and we all worked very well together. Anyway, and because we were stuck out in the middle of the bush, there wasn't much in the way of entertainment, so we just played sport. We only worked from 6:30 in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So after that, we just played sport. So I actually happened to play water polo, rugby, and hockey and basketball, all for the state, which was a very small state, by the way. But it was a really good life, and it gave me a good grounding. But my last year as a technician was working in the Hunter simulator, which in those days, you can imagine, that was going back to, they got it in the mid-'60s. So it was one of those valve ones, and it was static. It worked very well as an emergency channel, but to fly it was an absolute dog. And the pilot hated it. But I had a very practical boss, because in those days with the valves, we had a maintenance program. But if you went and checked the valve, you pull the tray up and you checked all the valves on a machine and then put them back in. Invariably, a lot of them wouldn't go back in properly. So after we'd done the maintenance, everything would be wrong. So my boss is very practical, and he said, listen, what we'll do, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we just left it. And if something went wrong, we would just go and look for that. We had a good maintenance schedule, so we would go and look for where the dog knows where to come from. We just changed that valve. So while there were only 4 of us on the simulator, so while they were in the office, I would be in the aircraft flying. And I actually got quite good at it. I mean, I could fly it better than the pilots, which wasn't too difficult because they only flew once a month, and they hated it. But anyway, I got to fly quite well, in fact, very well. And there was a rumor years later, which I only heard in the last probably 10 years, that the pilots thought that I flew so well, they would put me straight onto the Hunter as a pilot. Obviously not true, but it was a lovely story. But anyway, but in the meantime, I had been applying for pilot training. And they weren't all that keen to do it, because obviously once they train you as a technician, why would they want to put you through the flight side? They did do it occasionally, and it wasn't very successful, surprisingly. A lot of the guys, even though they were in the Air Force, only I know of a couple of other guys who actually succeeded going from technical side to the flying side. Anyway, the first time I got in the reserve, that didn't work. And then the second time I was accepted for pilot training, and then I broke my ankle about a month before, and that was the end. I couldn't go on the course. And the third time I sort of struggled on again. In fact, what they told me on the third time was that my grades certainly weren't good enough, and the other guys were all university types and not to apply. But fortunately, my boss on the Hunter squadron, when I was a technician, he knew I wanted to fly. And he was a short, little, stocky fighter pilot. And one day he said to me, as I walked through the hangar with my coat from working the simulator, he said, how's your pilot application going? And I said, no, they've knocked me back completely now. They said I'm not clever enough, and they're going with what they've got. And he said, don't accept that. He said, you go down there and you tell them you want another go. So I went down with cap in hand, and I went and said to the boss of the school, and I said to him, I'd like to do that again. I said, I was accepted last time, but only because I broke my ankle. Anyway, and I don't know if the boss from the squadron actually gone down and said to them, give this bloke another go. Anyway, they put me through the whole lot again. I had to go through it. It was a week-long process of medicals, and the funny thing about it, we went to actually South Africa for the inductions, or not induction, for the interviews and that, and they put us into various machines to see how coordination was. And I only found out afterwards that one of the problems I seemed to have had a problem was trying to keep this little ball in the middle with my feet and my hands. And anyway, when I went and did it again, the whole thing again, the chap actually said to me that stage, are you a pilot already? So I said, no. He said, well, it's amazing what you're doing here. So it just proves that you can actually perhaps teach yourself to be more coordinated. I'm not sure. Anyway, I was accepted that.
How old were you then, Steve? How old were you at this point?
I was 20. It was in 7. I was 21. Yeah, I just turned 21. Yeah, I was 4 years as a technician. I actually got to be a sergeant up to sergeant rank before I went into pilot training.
At that time was military service, was it mandatory for the youth? Or
It
no?
was, it was, the national service was, but from the pilot point of view, it was a permanent, it was a 10-year contract basically for pilot training. But the guys did come in, a technical side came in as on reserve, national service. It worked really well as well from that point of view. All my cousins ordered national service, and it was the best days of their life. It was only for a short while. But anyway, I was in permanent at that stage. And so then I was accepted. And I've been through one boot camp, so now I'm going to the second one. The pilot training was quite a bit harder, but fortunately I knew what it was like, and I got myself really fit. And another chap and I, who'd also been an army officer, he came to be a pilot training. We both were able to help quite a bit because we were both very fit, and we knew the way it went. Anyway, for the first 6 weeks, we did the book work and the study and that sort of thing, and then we started the flying. And the initial training was on a thing called a piston Percival Provost. I've sent you a couple of photographs of there, but and that was much. It was probably a bit smaller than about the same size as our Harvard, a British aircraft, but a big radial and tail dragger, and went through that all right. And then
were you in there with an instructor at first?
Oh yes, so side-by-side instructor.
Side by side, okay.
Yeah. And it was quite interesting because I know this is where the whole hunter thing came in, I think, because it took a while. We went to solo at about 15 hours because we did all the whole forced landings and aerobatics. And on a very windy day, one day, in this is down in the middle of Rhodesia, you get very windy and quite low cloud. We thought it was coffee time, so we all went and sat in the crew room, and my instructor came out and said to, "Hey, Murray, come out here, we're going to go flying." And I looked outside, the cloud was only 1,000 feet, it was howling wind, and I thought, I don't know what this is all about. He said, "We're just going to go and do circuits." And the penny never dropped at that stage. Anyway, we got airborne, and we bumped around the sky. We're a bit lower than normal circuits. I did 3 circuits. And then while he was on the 3rd circuit, he called up and he said, "Get the squadron commander to come out here for a solo check." So, and I've never really spoken about that. I think I've got it in the book there, but it was a complete surprise because it was a miserable day. But obviously, all the planets are aligned, I think. Anyway, the bloke came and jumped in, and I did 1 circuit. He said, "Do what you do normally." I jumped in and did 1 circuit, and he jumped out and said, "Just do that again." And so I was the first guy to go solo on the. Only thing I remember about it, people say, "Oh, the solo." All I remember is we used to do right-hand circuits, and in order to see the runway when I was downwind, I didn't have to look through the pilot. I didn't have to look through the instructor to see the runway. At once I could actually see the runway. Anyway, that was wonderful, and I was the first guy to go solo. And after that, everyone said it's one of those hurdles, I think, and everyone then went solo quite quickly after that. But that was interesting. And we completed that. I came top on that side. I'm not trying to embellish my record with you, but having gone through all the bad stuff, I found myself coming first at everything. Even though, certainly not in the classroom. I didn't get first in the classroom, but in the flying side, From then, when I finished that was our basic flying school. We went on to advanced flying. And that was in the vampire, that twin-tailed vampire, which you wouldn't be very familiar with in America either. They're quite popular around the world.
Tell me about those. Tell me about that airplane.
Yeah. It didn't want to go anywhere. Can I say to start with? It was a first-generation jet, and it didn't have the fuel control unit, so you couldn't just slam the throttle when you wanted to take off. You had to ease it on, And it wasn't a very powerful jet. It didn't have very good lookout. I've been in one years ago as a technician, and it was the most, you probably read it in the book, it's the most daunting experience because you were entombed in this aircraft, it felt like. And I remember, the first, like in a Provost with this great big radial, when you put the power on, the thing just leapt into the air. The tail came up and all the way went. The vampire, you trundled into the air, And it was very smooth to fly. But once you got over about 300 knots, it didn't have power controls, so it was very heavy to fly. Some people actually get tears in their eyes when they think about flying the vampire. I didn't. when I got out of the thing for the last time, I was very happy in a lot of ways. I was invited to fly one in Australia years ago. And I said with as much sincerity as I could, no, thank you, because the other problem with it, you couldn't really bail out of it. People had tried. It had an ejection seat, but the ejection seat was only worked if it was above 2,000 feet and you were doing, basically over 2,000 feet at a reasonable speed. Below that, you weren't going to survive. It was a first-generation ejection seat, so it was a sort of thing I didn't want to fly with a family because the chances of survival were probably too good. Anyway, that was the vampire. It did its job. It did, and that was my advanced flying. And when we got our wings after that, all of us went straight to OCU, the Operational Convergence Unit. Now, Rhodesia was a small air force. We had the Provost, which we also use for air-to-ground flying. So even though it was trainer, the Vampire, the same thing. We used it for training and also for weaponry. Then we had the Hunter, and that was our fast jets. And then we had other lighter aircraft, and we had DC-3s. And we tended to fly everything. You did a couple of years on each aircraft. And so we tended to fly everything. So when we came to do the OCU, the Operational Conversion Unit, even guys who would eventually go to helicopters still did the jet one. So we did that on the Vampire. We did rockets, guns, and bombs. And I think I threw a couple of lucky bombs at the end there, and I came top, and I was the weapons ace at the end of that. Now, this story becomes interesting now because we didn't have a two-seat Hunter. And the Hunter was a sort of second-generation jet, and a huge step up from the Vampire. The Vampire, this small engine, no fuel control. The Hunter went to 10,000 pounds of thrust. And we had the big engine Hunter. They had two models. The earlier model was small engine. Ours was the big engine. So what tended to happen, the guys went onto the squadrons. Typically, the jet guys would go to the Vampire, the squadron, operational squadron. Other guys might go to helicopters or to like coin aircraft or DC-3 or Canberra. We had a Canberra as well, which is like your B-57. And the Americans made it, they called it the B-57. Anyway, after they'd done probably a couple of tours, the guys would come back to the Hunter because it was the more advanced aircraft with no two-seater. And my friend and I came first, he came second on the flying and on the weapons. We found as soon as we started out, we finished the OCU about a month on the squadron, the Vampire Squadron. We now told we're off to the Hunter. So this was a very I had 300 hours at that stuff. It was a very unpopular from all points of view because these two young guys going straight to the Hunter was not unheard of. Plus the simulator was broken, so we couldn't even go and practice in the simulator, which didn't. Anyway, it was interesting. But I'll come to it later. There was a reason for it. But we eventually got airborne in the Hunter. That was compared to the Vampire. This is the airplane they wanted to fly. When you open the throttles, you got a big kick in the backside, and away you went. It was and it was so light under controls. In fact, even when a guy went flying on the Hunter for the first time, invariably all the base came out to watch because most of the aircraft weren't power control. So as you got airborne, it had very light controls, and you'd always wave as you left the runway with the light ailerons. In our case, in particular. And I think at that stage, I remember my other friend who came on with me describing the fact when he did his first soda, he was sitting on the tail somewhere. It was so far ahead of him. Anyway, it was interesting. And I had a couple of interesting circuits to land. And I'm actually surprised. I didn't know then, but most air forces don't have a single-seater. Or don't have a two-seater, perhaps like the Sabre or any other aircraft. They generally send up a chase plane with you. And all we did was my instructor went and sat in the tower. And if my circuit didn't look too good, he said, do this or do that. So it was really, we jumped in the deep end. But having said that, once I'd gone solo and we started flying, and I had what we sort of have an uncle, another guy that you go to do weapons with and that type of stuff, he flies alongside. It was amazing airplane to fly. Beautiful lookouts, lovely light controls. It's a lovely looking airplane anyway.
It's a good look. It is a good looking airplane, I think.
Yeah. It was just fun, and we had a good bunch of guys on the squadron. And within a couple of months, we had our first air show, and I think I'll send you some photographs of that when we went to this city, our neighboring city, and the whole town turned out. About 10,000 people came to watch this air show, And it was just good fun. And the good thing about our Air Force as well is that when you came to the end of your training, you would go on we call them jollies, overnight somewhere. And mine was to Cape Town. That was actually 3.5 hours flying to the south. And that was the first time I'd actually seen Cape Town. You can imagine flying all the way. It was 3.5, the longest flight I've ever done on a single seater, because we didn't have air fueling. And I'm going to send you a photograph of that. And it's a lovely photograph. My boss, he flew down with me, he took the photograph of me next to the mountain. And there's a lot of my friends, we all live around the world now, have got that in their lounge. Such a beautiful photograph of Cape Town on the Table Mountain. You've been there, have you, Greg?
Yeah.
Did you
yep.
get?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Lovely. Yeah.
Cape Town is amazing. Yep.
It is. Yeah, it still is as well. It's really terrific. Anyway, that was. We then started a bit of operations. We had Mugabe's guerrillas at that stage, which started to infiltrate the country, and they'd murdered some of the farmers, the white farmers, particularly, and black farmers, mind you. And their way of coercion was quite brutal. Let's put it that way. And
what year was this, Steve? What year was this?
That was now. We went to the hut in 72, and this is now mid-73.
Okay.
Yeah, and we did a couple of one particularly big strike. We actually went cross-border into Mozambique. At that stage, it was a Portuguese territory, but we had a backset. So that's when we started air-to-ground operations on the Hunter. And I must mention
tell me about your first operation, your first military, where you really dropped some bombs or did something.
There were 5 of us. We went to, there was a huge base in a big bend in the river, and it was very successful. It was our very, very first big one. We had, SAS, which is a bit like, you probably know the SAS, much like your SEAL team, but Rangers or something like that.
Right.
They dropped in the middle of the night, and then the first thing in the morning they mortared into this target. We had a piston Provost that I trained on, but the armed one, he actually talked us on from he's a forward air guy, and with 5 of us we went on one after the other it's like a big bend in the river, and we just used rockets. We had these SNED rockets. There were 36 of them. 18 on each side. We went in with one, and then we went to the guns. Now, I mention the guns now because this was a 30-millimeter cannon, and the Hunter had 4, and 1,500 rounds a minute it fired. It had 530 rounds, and to this day, the only thing that outpowers that in firepower is the A-10 Warthog. I understand the Hunter is second only to the Warthog. And it was built.
Did all your hunters have that many guns? That's just standard
no,
on there?
Had,
wow.
And a gun pack that dropped out the bottom. So it was also rearming this very quickly. You just dropped the pack, pushed the new one in, trained it up, and away it went. The whole object of the Hunter was built so it could take a Bear bomber, one of those big Russian things. With 4 cannons, if it went on its side, it could actually slice the thing in half, they figured. Anyway, for us, in our particular case, after you've done the first rocket attack on this one, we didn't have anything. We were able to go back in again, which is obviously wasn't a good technique, but we were able to restrike. And after the gun attack, there was nothing left. It was in the valley, in the Zambezi Valley, which is very a low felt, huge trees and the whole lot of it. By the time we'd come out with those 5 of us with those guns, there was nothing left.
Wow.
Now we're not too sure. We're not too sure about the whole outcome on the ground at that stage because it was actually external. But that was our first big strike. After that, to tell the truth, for a long while after that, the Hunter was only used in support of the helicopters because it was a guerrilla warfare. So the helicopters got held down by a large group of guerrillas they would call the Jetson. But then again, towards the end of the war, after I wasn't around at that time, they were started to use more externally as there were more and more guerrillas operating with bigger weapons. But that was the first big one. And at that stage, after we'd done that, about a month after that, I was then told I was going to go to South Africa and fly Mirages. Now, that should have, I guess, we knew a couple of guys had gone down at that stage. And I should mention the reason for it. We'd had 12 hunters to start with, and at one stage we lost one. And this was before any sort of action. the guy fuel pump burst, and he had to eject just short of the runway. So we now only had 11 hunters, and that was our main sort of strike aircraft at that stage. And anyway, the South Africans had this Mirage. Now I've got one here. You can see it here. This is a Mirage 3C. Now this is identical to the aircraft that flew against the Israelis used in the 1967 war. That was a Mirage 3C. That did all the damage in that war. And the South Africans got it at the same time as the Israelis. They then bought a newer model, which looks almost exactly the same as that, but it carried more fuel, a slightly bigger engine, and it was more of a ground attack. This was an air-to-air, basically an air-to-air aircraft, interceptor. And the South Africans, we were sort of supporting them because we were their buffer zone to perhaps guerrillas from the north. And they must have made some arrangement to say, listen, if we're looking at another aircraft, which turned out to be a Mirage F1, which is the later model. And they said, if you bring your pilots down and you actually bring your technicians, you guys can fly this aircraft. And when you're ready, you can take it back to Rhodesia. And when we get our new fighters. And that was the theory. That was 1973. And we understand, there's nothing definite about it, but that was apparently the arrangement. And that's where the fact is they wanted a depth. And that's why my friend Bordy and I went down, we were chosen to go down to the Mirage. My friend didn't go, in fact, because for other reasons. But anyway, it was myself and another captain. We went down there. We called it flight lieutenant, but it was in essence a
Were
captain.
You excited to get that call? I bet.
You know, this sounds a bit odd, but my ambition was to fly that Hunter. Honestly, and you can imagine, having read my book, it was almost unattainable for me because I had so many hurdles to cross to get to that thing. And all of a sudden, you know, I've just got my wings now. Expect to spend another 5 or 6 years if I'm lucky to get to the Hunter. I've done well on the flying side, so I was probably going to get there eventually if I kept my nose clean. But to go there straight there, I'd achieved my ambition, and I barely got my feet wet. You know, and especially a single seater and operationally now, and I was just really enjoying the Hunter, and I was just. And really, it takes you, I'd only got, at that stage, about 300 hours on the aircraft. And I remember when I was told about this Mirage, I knew they had Mirages, but I had a friend of mine who loved aeroplanes. And I remember he was a technician, riding down to where he worked. I said, what's this, what model am I going to fly, sort of thing, you know? And it wasn't, my mind was still sort of on the Hunter. But of course, that all changed very quickly when I got there. And in subsequent years, and I look back on it, it was an amazing airplane. I've actually worn this specifically today, quickly for a reason. This is the Mirage 3. This is actually my solo aircraft, 809. The chap in South Africa put it up for me. The badge I've got on the other side, this one here, is number 2 Squadron, South African Air Force. They flew in Korea. So when I wore my, even though I wore a Rhodesian uniform in South Africa, I always had my Korean medal on the other side, because that was presented to any squadron that flew in Korea. I think any unit that flew in Korea. They were also the premier squadron. They were the first international air force to fly the Sabre in Korea. And they've got a massive photograph and painting in their crew. The other one was just this is just a Mach 2 badge. When you get, it's a tick in the box when you go twice the speed of sound. But I just thought that'd be interesting for you guys, because you would know, obviously, with Korea and that time. Anyway, so now I'm off to the Mirage, and I should have been a lot more intimidated as well, because it was their premier squadron. And when I arrived there, I was then it was in 73, so I was 25 at that stage. But on the squadron, there was a colonel in charge. There were at least 5 majors, okay? And then there were about another 15 captains. And I was a second lieutenant. And I should have thought they were through. Why are there all these experienced pilots on this airplane? Here I am, you know? Anyway, it was a lovely airplane. Once again, to fly, it was just like a Hunter on steroids in a way. It was most of the flying was subsonic, obviously it could go supersonic, and we often flew supersonic because even on instrument flying, you'd fly through supersonic because when you came back into subsonic, if you were in a turn, you'd get a pitch up from the movement of the shockwave on top of the wings. And we often flew supersonic. It was a lot heavier on the controls in the Hunt, and that was deliberate because it had such powerful controls at the back there, the ailerons, huge ones, that if you slammed it across for a roll, you could actually, I guess they figured you could probably break it, if it was that, the controls were that powerful. In fact, in the two-seaters, if I took a guy for a ride, I used to always say to him, I want to roll this thing down, make sure you keep your head straight, because often they would just bash it against the side of the canopy. Yeah, it was designed as an interceptor, as I said initially. But what actually happened after the 6-Day War, or even the South Africans had got already, but it ended up in several air forces as a dogfighter because it, flown correctly, it was a really good dogfighter with that great big stab of wing delta. If you in someone on your tail and he came up behind you, you could just pull that thing hard and it would stop, as long as you didn't do too much. And the guy would sailing through. When they got their new Mirage F1, it had a tailplane. And we never flew this thing below 180 knots because if you ever stalled it or spun it would come out eventually, but you probably have to eject because it took so long. So we used to keep the speed above 180 knots. When they got this F1, that speed could come down to 125 that flight. So the first time I went to have a fight with one, well, there were two of us against this F1. He attacked us, and I thought, well, we're going to lose this fight. Anyway, when he attacked me, my leader called me into a tight turn to a break, and immediately said to me, reverse. And this chap had gone sailing through me. He couldn't slow down. So the first aircraft I shot down on camera was a Mirage F1, I mentioned while I'm there as well, it's something that became a passion of mine all my life. We had a guy in the squadron called Dick Lord, a South African. He'd gone to Britain, had flown in the Royal Navy, had been seconded to the United States Navy, and flew Phantoms that would have been, once again, in the early 70s. And at that stage, Americans might have been a bit earlier, but when he went across, but Americans had been problems in Vietnam because they had no guns on their Phantoms. They just had missiles. Right. And they weren't doing much ACM anymore either, dogfighting, because they thought, well, the missiles are sorting all our problems out. And that's when their kill ratio apparently at that stage was 1-1, whereas in Korea it had been up to 10-1 against the opposition. So they quickly got together the Top Gun school going, and Dick Lord was actually on a secondment. He wrote the unit orders for Top Gun school. Huh. And he just loved dogfighting. When he came back to South Africa, sort of after about 10 years or so, the South African Air Force got a hold of him and said, listen, we need you, He said, I'll only come back and fly on the Mirage because he knew that we did a lot of top dogfighting. And that was my first ride, was in the back seat of a flight before it even gone solo. Dick was going flying, just a lovely little fighter pilot, blonde, cocky little guy, but really nice guy. And a teetotaler, which was surprising. But anyway, he said he was going on a two-seater, and I said, any chance of just sitting in the back? He said, yeah, come along. And we did three. You only could do 3 engagements because there's so much afterburner going on. But the chaps, he was a bounce against 2. It was a 2v1. And the bounce shouldn't lose if he's got enough energy because he can climb out the fight. But he shouldn't be able to beat the other guys because they can maneuver together and sandwich and all that sort of stuff. He took him out 3 times in a row. And when he got down and he discussed it, he knew each maneuver they had made in detail. And I thought, man, that's what I want to do. And it became a passion of mine. It took a long time to get to the stage where I was looking from behind an aeroplane. I spent most of my time looking behind me eventually. But it became a really, because you fly in this aircraft by the seat of your pants leg, and a lot of the time, unlike today, when you've got so many warnings and head displays, someone once asked me, what is it like to fly a Mirage into combat? It's just like flying a Tiger Moth on steroids, because, I should mention something like a Camel from the First World War, because we just used to be rules of combat. We were going to jump in the aircraft, go and fight for 45 minutes, come back, land, and debrief and go and have coffee, These guys, the guys these days, will brief for 2.5 hours before, fly for an hour 30 on an F-35, whatever it is, and come and brief another 2.5 hours afterwards. And so we were having a lot of fun doing this at this stage. Yeah, so
explain the theory of dogfighting. I mean, what's really? I'm trying to imagine, because how was the visibility inside the Mirage? Was it good?
It wasn't up to the par of the aircraft these days. Even something like the Phantom was probably okay. Hunter was sort of okay. See, at that stage, they figured they didn't think they were going to dogfight again. You got something like the Sabre that's got this bubble canopy, you know. Yeah. And then when you come in up starting to build missiles, Mach, you're going to have this lookout. So the Mirage, you could only see back just to the ejection seat, basically, and not beyond. And the Santa was very similar. Now, what we did basically, our dogfight was 1 versus 1. So you would come fly towards each other, merge, and then the fight was on from there on. And that was fairly basic. You know, you kept visual. In fact, if you lost visual completely, you'd call rabbit and stop the fight. The other one was 2 versus 1. So we'd go out as a pair, mutual support of each other, about 3 kilometers apart, and the bogey would come and attack, obviously with a lot of energy. And from then on, it was comedy and control. We would say, brake, reverse, come up to me. You know, there was a lot of comedy involved in that as well. And but that all sort of tended to change. Well, once again, go back to Top Gun. These guys now realize that they're still, once the missiles improve, they still need to have this ability to have an aggressive spirit, to be a fighter pilot. I remember I've got a write-up by a colonel in the United States Air Force. He said, we must never stop doing ACM, air combat maneuvers, because it keeps up the pilot's aggressive spirit. And if the missile doesn't work, I was speaking to chaps I used to fly with here on F-18s in Qantas. You know, if people can get inside the missiles, the Russians have got one that is a close missile, but earlier on, 10, 20 years ago, you could get inside missile range. Then it became a dogfight, and perhaps even down to guns, perhaps. So you've got to keep up that aggressive spirit.
Right.
But in 1974, 2 aircraft came out, and this epitomized dogfighting. F-15 and the F-16. Both those aircraft, you can look at the other side of your tail if you want to. And that, of course, they're still making these aircraft, but they are the best of the best ever. I've done this in my book, but I did it. First painting I ever did of an F-16 was the first photograph they ever took of an F-16 flying on a magazine, flying over somewhere in, I think, Nevada. And I painted it because I said, that's the airplane I'd love to fly. I really do. It just, even more so than the F-15, which is it was definitely the better aircraft because of its capability and its war record. It's 110 for none at this stage. but an F-16 like the Mirage, you strap it on. You strap yourself into it. You're sitting on this rocket ship, and away you go. You know, and so that epitomized the 1 versus 1 dogfighting. The ability to be able to see all around you and have more power than weight, basically.
What's an average? How long would an average dogfight last before someone won? Usually, was it really fast?
Not necessarily. Obviously, depending on the 1 versus 1 would depend on the pilot's ability because we are same aircraft basically. So it could go. I mean, journey in the early days for me, it didn't last very long at all until someone was up behind me. But as your ability increased and you came to the same sort of level, it would be a stalemate. You'd end up in a circle of joy. And once you got down to they call it the level, the bottom level, which is the ground level, which we call 5,000 feet. It's rabbit, and then you pack up. So it could last. The 2 versus 1 was a bit different, but once again, depending on the ability of the guys, with same aircraft. I think when you get to dissimilar aircraft, then it changes quite a bit. And I never got involved in that at all. Unfortunately, all we had, I didn't even fly against a Hunter. We just flew Mirage as one against the other. So, yeah, but it's just a fact, Greg, is that you're flying in the air, this supersonic jet that's by the seat of your pants, you know, and even the only thing we in our aircraft, we had warning lights that told us when our angle of incidence was getting too high. But the later ones had warnings, but started shouting in your ear to tell you, you got to beep, 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 beep. But we didn't even have that. So you had a lot of feel about it, and it was amazing. These days, and I'll talk a little bit about later, this is what I would call a legacy fast jet, the Hunter and the Mirage. Now you go on to the modern fly-by-wires, and it's a bit different. And it is a whole new idea, and a whole lot more warnings about where you are, and a lot more safety features, which we didn't have. I'll just mention quickly, when I was flying with Qantas, I was a checking training captain. And I remember training it was a new captain, I think. I was training a new captain. And we get talking about the aircraft being flown and whatnot. And the South Africans had Mirages as well. And anyway, we got talking, eventually we got on this. He said, yeah, I started my training on the Mirage, And he said, I did 2 sorties. I said, I can't do this. It's too fast and too dangerous. And that's probably what I should have been in my head. I thought that I should have been more intimidated going there with 300 pounds and flying police. I'll also mention again, I can probably come to this later. I flew with when I went to Canada 2 years ago, at this test pilot school. I'll talk about it later, but I'll mention it now because it was not a young one. He was a retired French test pilot from French test pilot school in France. And he'd flown Mirage 2000, which is a fly-by-wire jet, also a Delta, but a fly-by-wire, whole different animal. And he'd flown other aircraft. And we were just having lunch one day as we did be talking, and I said, what aircraft would you like to have flown? He said, I'd like to have flown the Beast. And I said, what's the Beast? He said, the Mirage 3, what you flew. and even today, I was speaking to someone yesterday about that. I flew with guys here who flew the F-18 and the Mirage. As the F-18 Mirage was going out, F-18 coming, and they got to fly both. And I remember asking the one guy particularly, I said to him, because he was a senior attack instructor, if you could go back and fly again, which one would you fly? No question, the Mirage. It was something about the Beast, So it was. I think I appreciate it more now. Thinking back at it, when you read that book about some of the stories that on the squadron, it was when I was flying, there was sort of a peacetime air force. I'd come from an operational squadron in the Hunter, so I made the most of what I was doing, while I could on that aircraft. Yeah.
So you never did anything militarily. You didn't go on any military sorties in the Mirage.
No,
or you did. You didn't.
When I was on the squadron, they had the Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, was administered by the South Africans from the First World War. I think they got it from the Germans, and the League of Nations gave it to South Africa to administer. And of course, at that stage, they started getting guerrillas coming from the north, from Angola, into Southwest Africa, and they had a war probably a lot more active than ours was, because there are a lot more numbers involved, and also they had an enemy there. The Cubans came and flew Mirage, flew MiGs from Angola, and that's when our guys. But at that stage, I was going back to I went back to Rhodesia. We wouldn't have got involved either anyway, because we were Rhodesians there. But they got involved. In fact, they shot down a couple of F1s, shot down a couple of MiG-21s. Then they brought in MiG-23s, and that upped the game a bit. And the Mirage couldn't actually cope with the MiG-23. But there were I don't think there was any combat between the two at that stage. Later in the war, yeah. Lovely story quickly. Dick Lord, my lovely friend. I remained friends with him until he passed not too long ago. He wrote several books on that, but I used to go and visit him. I got cheap travel with Qantas. I used to go to South Africa and visit him in Cape Town, And he was a general in charge of that whole area unit, a big unit up in north in this what is now Namibia. And he also flew Mirages there, Mirage F1s. But after the war, he made contact with a Cuban MiG-23 pilot, and they became good friends, really good friends. And in fact, they've written a book called MiG Diaries, the Cuban pilot and a South African pilot, and they flew this Cuban out to South Africa, and Dick had passed away, but his wife June lives in Cape Town. I went and visited her about 3 months ago. Lovely, lovely Dick's wife, and they flew her down to meet her as well. So this warrior business about fighter pilots, even though it's combat and all that sort of thing, there seems to be a code of conduct chivalry between the pilots, which is long gone from a lot of other parts of military life, I suppose. Yeah.
Describe the first time you went Mach 2.
Yeah. one and only, Greg, because it really is just a tick in the box. It was designed to go that speed so you can catch a bear and shoot it down. In fact, the aircraft I flew had a rocket, you could put a rocket pad under the back. And we actually, if you see my book there, the Joy of Flying, that I'm climbing out of my first solo, that is a spacesuit sort of thing. We had the space helmet and everything to get up there to shoot down this bear bomber. So what they would do, they would get airborne in France, wherever it was, get airborne, go get the rocket on, scream up at Mach 2, shoot this thing down and go down again. So for us, it was just a tick in the box. But anyway, it was interesting because, and I described it in the book, it was shortly after I went solo. So what they do is I can't remember if it was actually clean. I think it was clean. We had supersonic top tanks there anyway. So it might have been with the tanks on. But no, it was clean because the fuel ran out fairly quickly. But anyway, I got airborne with this thing. I zoomed straight up to I went up to about 40,000 feet. And then I just lowered the nose slightly and went into full afterburner. Now, the Mirage, it's a very basic aircraft. This particular one, for a fuel gauge, it had a little fuel gauge on the side, which only started indicating when it had 130 gallons, which was basically the circuit minimum. Before that, it had a detote. So you had this little numbers thing clicking down. And when they refueled it, and they refueled it like a Cessna on the top. No, there wasn't any plug-in or anything like that. Anyway, when they refueled it, they put this detote up. And so when you were flying on a cruise, you'd hear this click, 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 click. Well, you'd see it clicking over down here. And there was still a lot of fuel going into the airplane. When you go in Mach 2, when I was accelerating full afterburner to Mach 2, now, and that's actually part of it, because now accelerating up to Mach 2, I was coming up and I actually aimed going back towards base. And as I got to all that happened, Greg, is as you're going, I'll just describe going supersonic. The best way probably to describe it, if you drop a boat in the water, you have the ripples going out either side. As you move forward, and immediately a bow wave attaches to the boat. So as you're moving in your boat now, you've got this bow wave. And if you're close to the shore, the ripples from the bow wave will make noise on the stones on the shore. That is your boom in an airplane. So as you start moving forward, all the waves go ahead. And when you're coming up to Mach 1, the bow wave on the nose, there's one on the nose, and there's one further back. There's the main wave is over the top of the wing, and there's one on the tail as well, depending on what's going on there. So as there's waves picking up, the drag's becoming is increasing at that stage. And then once you go through Mach 1, when you get to Mach 1.2, it's called Mach detachment, when everything's supersonic, because the wings are supersonic before the body is in that type of thing. Once you go through that and all the waves, now you just got these standing waves sitting on the aircraft. It's still a lot of drag, but from Mach 2 onwards, it just accelerates, basically. So it sort of struggles up to Mach 1.2, and then away you go. And I just remember going very quickly after Mach 2. But now, when you fly low level in a jet, and something like a Mirage, and we generally used to fly level about 7 miles a minute. So you're screaming along and the ground's going like this. And once you get up high level like you are on an airline, everything slows down. At Mach 2, it doesn't. The ground's still zooming past at our speed. Wow. But as I sort of got there, my first warning light came on for the fuel, which is the 130 gallon light. And I thought I should be in the circuit now. Here I'm at 40,000 feet going Mach 2. It didn't turn out because I wasn't experienced, and I just wanted to get back on the ground. And what I had to do, we couldn't take it out of afterburner. That we could take it down to mini afterburner, which you could break down to the minimum afterburner. I think we'd leave it in dry thrust, but we couldn't bring the power back. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the airflow, and there would have been a problem, and it could shut down. So we had to keep it in dry thrust and military power, and then just pull up. And I remember I went up to about 60,000 feet to slow down a bit so I could bring the power back. And the Earth is round, Greg. I found out when I got up. And it's very blue up there. That's the highest I ever went anyway. And then I just came down. I brought the throttle back and I actually landed with lots of fuel. But it was just the biggest impression for me was arriving at 40,000 feet at Mach 2, and I'm at circuit minimum fuel, basically. The gauges started to read. Yeah, but it was and I have a little badge. It's Mach 2, which is nice, and it's a tick in the box along the way. But I told you the other day, if we get this Mirage in Tasmania, I might have 80 years old in Mach 2. That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
That's good. That would be good.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
that's cool.
So we used to have a lot of fun. We had the way we operated, because we were multi-role as well. We would do gunnery, air-to-ground gunnery and rockets, skip bombing as well, which I mentioned your F-104 pilot mentioned the other day. I hadn't heard people talk about that much. That was nice, exciting. 100 feet, dropping your bomb away from the target. And then we'd go down to Durban and to do supersonic ACM. And the only reason for that is that we were based up in Pretoria, which is in the middle of South Africa, and we could only go supersonic above 30,000 feet. Below that, the boom is just, it just causes too much money, basically, because anyone's ever had a broken toilet or a crack in the wall would blame the Air Force for their booms. You know? So we'd have to go to 30,000 if we wanted to do our supersonic flying up there, which was to do with interception. So if we did dogfighting, it had to be subsonic. And the thing with supersonic so quickly anyway, so what we would do for our weapons camps, we'd go down to Durban and then fly out to sea and go supersonic. In fact, I must describe the first fight I had was with my co-student who came from Rhodesia. We stood for the fight. We came towards each other, full afterburner, and we crossed both supersonic. So now we got a crossing speed of 2.4 Mach. And then we pulled into the fight. We never saw each other. So we had to be vectored back again. And then we vectored back and we sort of kept the fight. We just wanted to see. Thereafter, for the rest of that fight, in case we lost each other again, we found a ship sailing into Durban. And we had our fights there. And we were invariably going in the fight up and down, invariably going supersonic at some stage. And I didn't think enough about that because we were flying somewhere between 15,000 feet and 5,000 feet. And you can imagine us going supersonic at the bottom of dive at 5,000 feet under the top of the ship. When after he landed, I said to my friend, I think we can expect a phone call at some stage. But it would have shattered their ears, I would imagine. We never heard anything. Yeah. So that was interesting.
How long did you fly the Mirage then?
3 years.
How long?
300, just on 500 hours, I think, for 3 years. On the hunters, I would have done, in 3 years, I would probably have done more in the region of about 1,000 hours. But we were flying a lot in the teeth because we were operational. So I've got about close to 400 hours on the hunter and 500 hours on the Mirage. Yeah. And, it was I guess in a lot of ways, it's in reflecting on it has been the good side because I tried to make the most of a peacetime Air Force flying. You know, I think I mentioned in the book that I used to go and do air tests, and everyone hated doing air tests. It was horrible because they had to go across there, jump in this jet. Well, after I did my first air test with this clean aircraft with no radar, and they always sprayed them brand new, and they had a very sophisticated test unit, and all you had to do is jump in and just read out these dials, get back and land, and you got half a tank of fuel left. I used to say to the guys, but the first time I said to the engineers, listen, can I stay up there and go and play some, They looked at me a bit strange. They said, yeah, sure. So the next time we went back, nothing I mentioned in the book there, and I said to the bloke I went with, he said, Steve, I'm afraid you're going to have to go back tomorrow. Your Mirage has got a couple of problems. And I said, do I really have to, Meanwhile, I just shot across there, jumped on the Mirage, did my test, and went and just played, low-level aerobatic style, a lot of it. The aircraft was just so much fun to fly. Yeah, and also there was a sort of downside. It was an interceptor, and they had a fairly sophisticated ground control intercept radars. So a lot of the time we might have to get two of us to get up in a pair, and the training fighter controllers one of us would stooge in 0.86 somewhere, and the other guy would come and it'd be vectored onto you and attack you. Then after half an hour, you'd switch over, then you'd go into your radar. The radars are very basic as well at that stage. You could barely lock onto a guy at 8 miles from behind. And I used to, when the radar didn't work, I used to put duty not carried out because invariably if my radar fell over, I'd have to go back and be a stooge again, while the other guy came onto me. And the sad part about it, you can see the guy coming. You should be able to go and attack him. You shouldn't just sit there and be shot down, type of thing. So if there was any downside to it, we did a bit of that, and that was a bit disappointing. It would have been, we wanted at one stage, all the bosses went on, I don't know what happened, but we were just left with about 4 of us on the squadron. And one of the Rhodesian guys, he was the captain. And we went to him and said, listen, let's do this the way it's done properly, you know. And because we had operational readiness platforms at the end of the runway, you could, you know, the type of thing you got, that's all plugged in. All you got to do is press a button, the engine starts, and away you go. So we actually went and spoke to the technicians. We want 2 aircraft down at the readiness platform. We want 2 aircraft to get airborne and go and strike a target somewhere. Yeah, we did, because that was a part of our role. We went and did a strike. 2 of us did a strike. And as we climbed out to come home, we'd be scrambled by the ground control intercept guys. So the 2 guys that operated would scramble up to us. We vectored on. And as we saw the visual, we went into a dogfight. And so we had a good dogfight. And then the thing, once again, going back to the basic Mirage, it had no navigation equipment. It had 1 ADF because it was designed to be vectored by radar, ground control intercept through a fight. And then when the fight was over, we vectored down onto ground control approach, radar. So now it is all under radar. So we didn't need that type of thing. So anyway, That's what happened. We had our fight, and the 4 of us are vectored back down in 2 pairs, back to the base on radar, and landed. So we'd done navigation, which is the first aspect. We did low-level navigation. We did the strike on the ground. The 2 guys got scrambled. We did GCI, and we came back for GCA approach and landing tower. So we done a whole operation for the squadron operation in one flight. But of course, the bosses all came back the next day, and we went back to normal. But it was really good fun, yeah. Yeah.
What was after the Mirages then?
Mirage, yeah.
Yeah, Mirage. Yeah. What happened after that?
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yes, after that, the war in Rhodesia was hotting up quite rapidly, and they were short of pilots. I mean, not pilots. Well, they were short of pilots, but aircraft particularly. We used the Alouette 3, which only aircraft would get because of sanctions. The Alouette 3. And so I went back to helicopters. As I said, we did everything. Most of us Mirage guys did eventually go back. In fact, all of us went back by helicopters. But I did my helicopter training in Cape Town, which was lovely.
Oh, how was that? How did you like flying helicopters? Was that a letdown after the jets?
If anything, I'd actually put my name down to go back in here, because I lost a very good friend in war. In fact, 2, really. One guy was an ex-hunter pilot I flew with. He was one of my uncles on the squadron when I was on Hunters. And another guy was just a good friend of mine. And it just seemed I was just having fun on the jet. And anyway, that's what I request going back to the helicopters. I guess people often ask me about the difference. They're so vastly different. And it wasn't exciting. I wasn't excited about being flying helicopters at all. And in fact, I got to hate seagulls very much when I got to Cape Town, because they could hover a lot better than I could initially. You know? They used to come and steal the food next to my chair, hovering there. Anyway, once I got the hang of it, and I often mention this, it's so versatile, you know. We'd go and have a barbecue in the mountains. Once we'd gone solo, we'd just pick up and go and land in those mountains behind Cape Town, have a nice barbecue, come back down again. And then the one time I mentioned, because I was still a young fella then, flying down the beach just north of Cape Town, the lovely Blouberg Strand, and there was a girl walking her dog there. And so I thought, well, this should be fun. So she flew down and hovered next to him, not too close. She was obviously used to it because the chopper's there. And she gave me a cheery wave, and I said, well, you can't do that on the Mirage. so the burst out. And then going back to the war as well, I eventually really got to like the helicopter, and I still fly them because, especially in northern Tasmania where we lived, it's such a beautiful area. Man, to just pick up the family home, as you got one of our videos I sent you, take your daughter to school in the helicopter, you know? It's just so versatile. It's just so versatile. It's fun. And I was just fortunate I got to fly all the stuff, you know, at the end of the day.
What copter did you fly in Rhodesia? What helicopter were you on?
They were all the Alouette 3. All Alouette 3. It's a French aircraft. And there was only one civil aircraft, because we couldn't get spares because we were Rhodesia.
Right.
There were sanctions. So there was a civilian helicopter in Alouette 3 in South Africa. And there was the most unserviceable aircraft that's ever been in history. Because Every time we needed spares, that we had, at one stage with the South African chopper, we had up to 40 in Rhodesia. So anytime something went wrong, that aircraft needed 20 engines or whatever. So they all came via Rhodesia and came up to us. And we made the most of it. I've described it. We made it a gunship, put a 20mm cannon out the side, and that then was, we had in the cockpit, we'd have the pilot, army commander, and the gunner who sat crossways in the aircraft. Very, very successful. The fire force exercise that we did, I would love to talk about sometime. It's in the, I think, oh my God, it's very successful. The unit we flew with, who flew with us, were the Rhodesian Light Infantry. And I read about this recently, and it really surprised me, because it was even mentioned by an independent military organization to say the Rhodesian Light Infantry were probably the most successful unit in history. I remember going on one bush tour, because we used to we'd be in base for a week and go to a forward airfield for a week, for 3 weeks. And I remember going with one commander, one of the commanders. We had 4 commanders, RLI commanders. And the one was 100, they had a T-shirt which they had made, 100 for none. You know, wow. And the record was 130 born, that I was told. And wow. I know they claimed all the kills, but the majority of the kills would have come from our gun, the 20mm. When we went into action, we'd pull up into over the group of terrorists or guerrillas, and the gun would do the damage. And any mopping up was done by the troops who we dropped on the ground. But they were extremely efficient. They just looked like Rambo. They wore T-shirts, shorts, and bandoliers of things, especially the MAG gunner. And what I often mention specifically, because when I first went up there for the first few bush tours, I was on a trooper. And the trooper was the same aircraft, but the pilot in the front, 2 troops sitting next to the pilot facing back, 2 troops in the back facing forward, with a gunner out the left-hand side with twin 303 Browning machine guns. And what had happened, once the K car had pulled up the gunship, it pulled up and done the damage, the army commander would put down troops where he thought these guys might be escaping. And they were quite close to the action quite often. And anyway, the aircraft are now quite heavy because we're full of maximum fuel we could carry. And then coming the K car guy would took into an LZ, and coming into this LZ. Now, aircraft wasn't a particularly big aircraft, so you had to sort of, in a pretty small areas to land. So you'd have to come into the flare and then start applying power. And as you're applying power in a helicopter, it can get close to what they call vortex ring, where it's like a stall on a fixed wing, because you're putting so much power, the blades are going up. And it's not like the aircraft stall, because the blades going around as well. So it's all, the aircraft can start rocking motion. And what we'd often find, I've described it with these guys, these troops, as you came into the flare and going towards the ground, they would be out. And they'd jump out exactly the same time, because if they didn't, the aircraft would start doing this. And as soon as they were out, you could feel it. You just pull it out of there, so you're out of danger immediately. My first time, in my very first fire force, the very first was the first 2 days in the bush. We went into one action. There was a big hill, and the guerrillas were over here, and they were firing, you know. And anyway, the gunship had done what he could with them, and he put me down quite close to them. And he said, when you pull out, turn hard left and back around. So I'm sitting here with a great big hill here. So I put the guys down, turned out left, and went around the hill. As I got being the hill, I just bullets. And I suppose about 10 feet above the trees as I went over the top of them. And of course, this bloke shouting above me saying, "You're over the top of the contact." You know, he wanted me to turn aside this hill. It looked a bit close to me. Anyway, they never hit us at all. That was very good. But I'm saying that's how close you got the action, and that's how good the troops were. They were on the ground and away. You know, it was an interesting time as well. Yeah.
How many of those did you go on? Those missions?
It's almost on a daily basis, really. Where you're in the bush. Yeah, not successfully. I mean, people often talk about war. It's 90% boredom and 10% sheer terror, I suppose. I never felt it like that. I mean, in the terms, that fire force was so successful and so well run because it was all because we didn't have airplanes, we didn't have people. In that particular one I'm talking about now, those guys didn't stop firing all day. So, well, not all day, but when they kept on firing, eventually we sent in a Lynx. It's a Cessna 336 with a push pull. We put rockets and guns and bombs all over that thing as well, the poor airplane. But Brantam as well, which was napalm, and he put that down as well, and then eventually they were still firing. So then he called in the Canberra, the bomber, and we had our little bombs. They were little round alpha bombs called, and they're full of flechettes inside. And when they hit the ground, he dropped them from 300 feet, and they just destroyed everything. And so we called everything in, and by the end of that, it was all over. But I'm saying It was for maximum loss of life. So we weren't going into I have stories of guys in Vietnam. Sort of, we got 50 Iroquois, or you call them Hueys, going in there, virtually air taxing. I met one guy in Qantas. He came and flew with us there. He got shot down 3 times in a day.
Wow.
It was ours. We didn't have that sort of airplanes. So as soon as we pitched up and there were too many of them, we got down and called in the big guys. So at the end of the day, in fact, I only got hit once. And that was by a drunk guerrilla, would you believe? We got called out to this guy. He got there, and he was standing out in the open, blasting away. But it was a very successful operation because it had to be, because we didn't have the manpower, the resources, or anything.
Right.
Unfortunately, at the end of the day, it became a political exercise. Unfortunately, yeah. And that was I was there for 18 months for the first time. Then I went to instruction on the lovely little airplane called CMA-Ketty SF-260. And that was the best dogfighting I ever did, I think, because it had a lookout of an F-16, power of a Hunter, inclined seat like a F-16, fighting flap, and I had a lot of fun on that airplane.
And that was just for training, that plane?
Training. But I have to mention now that the guys who joined the Air Force at that stage, like we all wanted to fly the Hunter because you want to fly the best jet, the best airplane on the jet, But at that stage, when I started instructing, I realized these guys all wanted to fly helicopters. And I'll explain it. Because in an Air Force, I don't know, I believe in all Air Force, but I assume so. When you finish your course, you grade it, depending on how you come in the course. Fighters, bombers, transport, helicopters. Now, in our war, at that stage, which was now in 78, there was sort of really hotted up at that stage. The guy running the war in combat was a helicopter pilot, the guy in the gunship. And I'd been there myself, where you in the gunship, now you're over the top of the action. The army commander's sitting here, and he's flying backwards because he's looking down to see where his troops are. And if he's inexperienced, he hasn't a clue what's going on half the time, getting used to it, or he's puking because he's flying backwards. So that's the other thing. Then you've got to talk the army, the troops will give orders to shoot where you've got to shoot. So he's giving the command to shoot, and then dropping the troops with the G cars, the trooper cars around. And then if that doesn't work, calling his other aircraft and even calling the jets. The jet pilot, whether it be a Hunter or a Camp, all he does is get airborne, fly along until he sees some smoke. He's given the direction of fire, the front line of drone troops, drops his bombs or his rockets and goes home. The army commander then, the helicopter then takes over and continues the war. So you can see the attraction for these young guys. So a couple of us Mirage guys decided that wasn't good enough. So what we used to do is part of their training, whenever you are training a guy, aerobatics, for example, you have a line feature. So if you're doing a loop, you go over the top of the loop and you want to come out on the same line feature. So you pick a road or a railway line, whatever it is. So I actually ran the instructor's course for a short while at one stage. And I said to the guys, what we do now is when you go out to teaching aerobatics, you go to your line feature. If there's someone there, you're fighting for it. so there's a dogfight. The students get to see what it's like to dogfight, and you hopefully stop them from playing when they go solo, which didn't, unfortunately, but still. But that's what we did. So I got to dogfight there again as well. And there was one guy in particular I know specifically because I met him 30 years later. He said to me, because I remember several times my line feature must have been the same as my friends because we used to fight over it. And he said to me one day, every time we went to the area, he'd say, look out for Murray because he's in the air today, he's going to come and fight us. And he went on to fly Mirage in South Africa. So he said, I got one guy interested in flying fighters. Anyway. Was it? Yeah?
No, go ahead. Finish.
No, I just said it was a lovely little airplane. And the guys all hated it initially because it was a slight aircraft compared to the big piston engine. I hated the Provost, to tell the truth, because it was always wanting to catch his tail drag, always wanting to catch his tail on the ground. It didn't want. To me, it was underpowered compared to this little thing. And of course, I wanted to fight it. And they used to say to me, "Oh, we love the Provost." I said, "Well, you go up in your Provost, I'll go up my SF-360. We'll see who wins the fight." Because there's no contest.
Did you enjoy teaching then?
I did very much. I can honestly say it's probably the most rewarding flying I've done. I can honestly say that. I mean, purely from giving it back to the industry. I can honestly most rewarding. And come back, there's a bond that, and you might have heard this before, I feel it. There's a bond between instructor pilot and a student. And in the Air Force, it's not a friendship bond at all because, you sir, and he's just the thing. But those guys still write to me, Greg. That's 50 years,
wow.
55 years ago. They're still in contact with me, and I've got books. Thank you. But one of the books said, "Patience is a virtue," because at one stage we were trying to churn out pilots, and we'd have four students at a time, and we couldn't debrief. Well, I didn't do that. I couldn't debrief and brief them at each one, and still fly 4 sorties a day. So I used to brief them together, and I just said, "You got to suck it up. If I'm giving one guy a hard time, because he did something wrong, you just got to try to learn from it and just accept that." Anyway, those guys, particularly the ab initio guys, even the helicopter guys, I did a lot of helicopter instruction as well. They still write to me, and it's a lovely bond. Yeah, and also when I got to the airline, for example, it's just this bond. There's more of not a friendship, but there's a closeness because in Australia it's no captain, sir. It's Steve and whoever it is. And those guys are still my friends. I get Facebooks all the time from around the world. One of the guys I trained as a captain, he's a 787 pilot, and Qantas flies to Fort Worth, to LA, and I get these photographs from all over the world. It's lovely. Yeah, it's definitely from a professional point of view, it was probably the most rewarding flight I've done. Yeah.
Okay, so how did it end? How did you get out of the Air Force then, or what happened at the end?
Well, politically, this goes back to the Mirage. About the time I was fitting up for the Mirage, 1976, South Africa had been supplying us with whatever we needed at that stage. And this is just conjecture on my part, although we did get a briefing by a guy in 1976 that the gold price dropped below $1,000 an ounce. And it was the first time South Africa had to borrow from the World Bank, as I understand it. And so immediately Kissinger and these contemporary in England, Owen, came out to South Africa and said, shut Rhodesia down. So it was political at that stage. It wasn't militarily at all. And it took another couple of years. Smith, who was our prime minister, then accepted that. And he got together with all the nationalists, the guys in the country, and also Mugabe and Nkoma, who were external, supported by Russia and China. And they had an election, and the guy Mozambique won, and Mugabe and Nkoma wouldn't accept it. So we were back to war again, and with the black prime minister now, would you believe? Anyway, and then it was Maggie Thatcher who said either to Mugabe and Nkoma, unless you accept another election, and with you guys involved, we're not going to support you anymore, and that's what happened apparently. They had the election, Mugabe won, numerically and probably through the barrel of the gun, I don't know. But anyway, that's when it ended. And by that stage, he'd been talking about the day of the long knives way before that. That never actually eventuated. Things got a lot worse later after my time. But anyway, so I went for another year or so, but they then obviously didn't really want us in, and they gave us our pensions early, and they let us go. And so I took the chance. And
what year was this, Steve? What year was this?
1980 was independence. In 1981, by 1980, end of 1980, I decided I was going to join the airline. A friend of mine had left already and joined Air Zimbabwe, and I just had to get my licenses. But fortunately, a wonderful thing came up. I was flying helicopters instructing, and I was actually posted to fly Hueys. And we had Bell 205s. And they called me at headquarters and said, listen, we need you to go and fly the Hunter again as an instructor and a flight commander. Would you like to do that? I was jumping around at a jump. So I went back to the Hunters, and I told them I was leaving. And they said, no, we just need you for 6 months. And I went back to Hunters, and we actually got at that stage, we'd stolen all, Kenya had Hunters during our war. And every time they got spares sent to them, they didn't end up in Kenya, they ended up in Rhodesia somehow. So they parked all their Hunters up against the fence, and they got given other aircraft by the British. And we bought those after the war. So in 1981, we went up and picked up these Hunters, and there was a two-seater. So I became the very first real instructor in Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe then. And so I was flying the Hunter. I also had a helicopter there because I was also the search and rescue for the fighter base. And they needed instructors for they were short of instructors on the jet. So I'd go up and fly a Hunter. Then go across to the training squadron, fly a Janet, probably have a dogfight or two, and then in the afternoon go to fly the helicopter. That was almost 6 months ahead. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I'd actually got my private pilot's license at that stage, and as an instructor, I could give licenses, private pilot licenses. So I was actually giving licenses away as well. I was flying a light Cherokee thing and giving people licenses. So it was a really interesting last 6 months in the Air Force. To remember again.
Well, did not many Air Forces do the whole thing? You fly the jets, you fly right in the United States. It's way different than that. You're kind of stuck with something, right? But even to this day, more so. In fact, I think in Australia, for example, only the guys who go during OCU, weapons conversion, people who are wanting to go to the jets. Otherwise, they go to everywhere else. Here, the helicopters are flown by the Army, I think, in the Air Force, in the United States as well. So, it's very different. Greg, if I could have sat down when I aged 15 and say, well, what do you want to do in your life as a pilot? And write that script, I couldn't have got a better one that came to me, than what I could have written myself. I was very fortunate. I realized that. You were clearly born to fly. I mean, your enthusiasm still is, it's very catching. You know what I mean?
Well, this is another story I probably don't even got in the book. When I was turned down for the third time to be a pilot, and I was called in by the technical officer because now I was coming up to be a sergeant. And the bloke in charge of the base, he said to me, really, perhaps you shouldn't be doing this. Someone's probably trying to tell you shouldn't be doing this. So I thought, with money that I didn't have, I went and had one of these occupational therapists, and I spent the whole day with her. I had to write all sort of stuff and answer questions, and then I had an interview at the end of the day. And I've still got the report. And she said to me, you've got to be a pilot. At that stage, I had a horse. You see in the book, he was a wild thing. And I rode every day, and I just loved riding. I didn't do anything. I didn't play polo cross or anything. I just loved being in the bush and riding. And he's a fire-breathing dragon. He just wanted to gallop everywhere and everything. He gave me a lot of confidence. But anyway, she said, either you become a pilot or you become a cowboy. There was so that sort of kept me directed, I guess, at the end of the day. And I'm still there. I must admit, I'm happy. I just feel fortunate that I've still got this passion for it.
Okay, so when did you leave? When did you leave Rhodesia?
I left 1981. I left the Air Force. I got into Air Zimbabwe, and that was a good time because I flew the bike out. I'd never flown a multi-engine, and that was a turboprop, only for 18 months. And then I went on to the 707 and the 720. And that became into the first time I'd actually been overseas. It was my first flight in the 707 to London.
Oh, so how was flying the commercial planes versus everything else?
It was, one of my friends was sitting down there. We had a briefing on the 707. we were sitting there, my friend was sitting next to me, and the bloke was going on about flying a jet and how difficult they were and whatnot. My friend leaned across us on board. He said, when you pull the stick back, the houses get smaller. When you push it forward, the houses get bigger. That's what it described it. No, I didn't. I just, it's more the people, I suppose. The flying it's so professional. That's what I probably enjoyed more about airline flying than anything, was how professional it is, as a rule. I mean, everything's done by the book for safety standards and everything, especially not so much in Zimbabwe, because there was still some of the old Second World fighter pilots and that, and you had to do what they wanted. It wasn't as bad as it was before my time, but it was still, you sort of had to have a book of what each guy did type of thing. So, but for the most part, it was, and then the people, my first flight in a Viscount was around, I don't know if you went to Zimbabwe at all, but, it was up to Victoria Falls, that's the biggest falls in the world, and now we're flying up there. My training captain is sitting next to me, and it's lunchtime now, and we go along, and he said, I don't know if you're going to eat that rubbish, And I've been served by this beautiful blonde girl who's giving me a tray with a starter, a main course, and a dessert. And I looked at him and I said, the last meal I had on an aeroplane was my gunner passed me a can of Spam with a teaspoon. And I had to fly this helicopter with my knees. I said, you're speaking to the wrong person here, because all he'd ever done is flown airlines. And the people, they're just a lovely bunch of people. And especially when I started going overseas, we used to fly in the 707 to London, Frankfurt, and Athens. Athens, good. In my book there, we used to spend 7 days and get a roll of drachma and go spend it on the beach in a little island called Skiathos. It was brilliant. So that side of it, I suppose. But the flying itself, it was, I enjoyed it, Greg. I really enjoyed it. I mean, you're getting radar vectored into London, and everything's got to be done just by the book, and there's always a bit of a joke, and it's instrument flying. If I had a problem with flying, if anyone, it would be instruments. It was right in the beginning. It did seem to be well and everything, but instruments seemed to give me a bit of hard work. And of course, airline flying, most of it's on instruments, especially when I was on the 707. Most of it's hand flown because the autopilot's not that good. So most of it was hand flown instruments, and hand flown approaches. And some of them, obviously in Europe, some of it's really bad. So it was a challenge, and it was good. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
And then you did the 747, correct?
Well, I did. When I was there, you see, about the mid-'80s, Mugabe had told us you couldn't be a white man and be a Zimbabwean. He's trying to tell me an African. I'm a sixth-generation African. But anyway, we were trying to get out of there. Things were going bad. The inflation was starting to pick up. The only way I could make him survive in Rhodesia was Zimbabwe, was to bring back stuff from London and sell it because they couldn't get it in. So I was looking around, and I'd written to, must have been 80 different airlines in the world. And only at the end of the day, the one that I really wanted to go was Cathay Pacific. And the chief pilot wrote to me one day. I was too old already. I was too old. I was 30. By that stage, I was 37 or 38. They were pilots up to 35. He wrote and said, I'm sorry, you're just too old for us. I need chief pilot wrote me. I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
Anyway, it turned that I was, then other thing I was trying to do was get to Australia because I wanted a home. And Zimbabwe obviously wasn't a home anymore. So I came across here, and they wanted me here in the Air Force as a helicopter pilot. I came and had an interview. And I've had the letter back to say, no, you come from a communist country. So what do you take me? I mean, the whole world supported Mugabe, and especially the Australian Prime Minister, Fraser. He was the great champion of Mugabe, and they eventually took some dives, but they became so short here many years later. But anyway, I got back from that thing, and Cathay called me up, age 40. We need you. We just put a whole bunch of 747. So I went across there, quite a big course, all of us about the same age, and we flew the 74, which was, once again, that is a lovely airplane. Oh, man, the thought of them not flying anymore, it just makes me very sad, and it does. It is a lovely, I mean, it was like I flew the 73 for a long time, especially the later ones, 800s, and it just flew like a 737. It was just a bit more inertia. But just to love it, to land. I mean, my very first landing on line, we went to Vancouver, and then we were coming down, and we'd done a 10-hour flight, whatever it was, from Hong Kong, And we came in, he was my leg, he let me, and as we came, we landed. At that stage, things are fairly automatic. So things like the speed brakes, as you touch the ground, the wheels spun up, the speed brakes up, and the lever came back. Anyway, it came when we, and I knew we were down, and I said to the engineer, speed brake. And he leaned across and he grabbed and he pulled the speed brake up. And anyway, we taxied off the end of the runway, and the engineer apologized to me. He said, because there was a 300, those days, straight engineer. He said, Steve, sorry, I didn't know we had landed. so the captain says to me, you're not getting another landing out of me after that one. That was my first landing. But how can I say? It's not much skill involved. It was done on the 747 by numbers, basically. You didn't do tight circuits like we did in the 737. Everything was done very sedately, but lovely airplane to fly. It really was. And then I flew the TriStar.
Oh, yeah. Is that the rumors true? I hear pilots say that was a really cool plane to fly.
Unfortunately, I flew them in Cathay. Cathay it's a private airline, so they keep the bottom line fairly fluid. I mean, even like in the 747, we had autopilots on the 747 at that stage, but Cathay got rid of it. They made the engineer run the throttle for you. And when it got to the TriStar was way ahead of its time, way ahead. It's this RNAV stuff, which is all the navigation done, linked order navigation and vertical and horizontal. It was all there. And but Cathay and their wisdom took it all out and put the old INSs back in there. And so it wasn't. But just to prove it, the engineers, when they got into the aircraft, they'd switch on the power and they'd go and do the walk around because there were so many lights came on, warning lights, until it all settled down and warmed up, and then they all went off again. But there were a couple. I needed about 18 months because something came up and I got a job in Australia. But I don't even 18 months. I probably did about 6 months. But there were a couple of things which rather impressed me compared to any other aircraft at that stage. You had active ailerons, which means that when you come in to land and you select your first flap, the ailerons went down as well. I know they all do it now. So your ailerons will now become flaps. So you had movement and it was a flap movement. Then the other thing, DLC, which I've never heard of again, DLC means direct lift control. So as soon as you stick the flap down, a bit of the dive brakes went up. So now you're going down. Now, if you're going, for example, you're going low on the thing and you want to pull back, the dive brakes, you don't have to change the attitude technically. All you're going to do is pull the stick back, the dive brakes come down, and you keep the same attitude. It gives you a lift. And but conversely, if you're going too high, it's pushing the nose forward. The whole aircraft doesn't change attitude. The dive brakes go up higher, and it just slips back onto the center. Clever aeroplane, really clever aeroplane. But the problem in Cathay, in Hong Kong, was that horrible runway. If you were coming around did you ever go to Hong Kong at all, at the old runway?
I've only landed there once, yep.
On the old runway?
I don't remember. It would have probably been, in the late 90s. Was that when that was? I don't know.
That was. I think that would have been the new runway then. Yeah. Kai Tak is the one that went to. You actually flew. I remember when I went for my interview at Cathay. When I was going around the corner to land, all I could see down here was Washington from the building we were flying over the top of. That's how close you got. That's how close you got to big. And all the buildings were built going down the flight path of the aircraft.
Yeah.
But if you got the bad wind, you get two winds coming into Hong Kong. The bad one was the one that came off the sea, so you had to put a bit more bank. There's about 15 degrees of bank to turn onto the runway, but the one with the wind from this time, she might have put up about 20 degrees of bank. And I never experienced, but one of my friends who was a training captain there, he said sometimes you had to put a bit of rudder on to get it around. Now in the gym, you just don't do that anymore in a jet, unless you're doing a slow roll, but
right.
it ran out of a little bit of aileron authority, but then there's exceptional sort of circumstances. But yeah, it was a very smart aeroplane. It was a pity they didn't fly it the way it was meant to be flown, sort of.
Yeah,
anyway.
I guess just cargo places use them now. Are any airlines really flying those?
I think they've gone great. I think they're all gone. Yeah, the only the cargo mainly now is just 747s basically, and even the new 747s, the 747-8, not an ever cargo as well. Fortunately, I've got Flight Simulator on my virtual reality here, so I can fly a 747-8 off the old runway at Hong Kong, which is lovely. And it flies. This viewer was amazing. Anyway, sorry.
In your book, you talk about Ian Smith and that you went and saw him later. Tell that story. That's kind of interesting.
Yes, I'm very pleased you asked me that, because he's been very maligned in the world because of the whole white-black thing and everything. He's a farmer. He was a fighter pilot in the Second World War. He got shot down on Spitfires. And that's probably the only reason they didn't invade us after we declared independence, because the story goes that they wanted to come and invade us at Rhodesia. And apparently there was a delegation of RAF pilots went to see the government and said, we're not going to do that. These guys fought with us 20 years ago. And McMillan Smith was a pilot. He got shot down, for goodness sake, flying Spitfires. Anyway, and he was just a farmer, Greg. He wanted to do the right thing. He thought for all the people, okay? So what happened at one time, the farm that he had his farm just about 20 minutes flying from where we were on the fighter base. I was an instructor at the time, and he decided he wanted to go to his farm on the Jennet, the SA-260, because he said it looked like a little Spitfire, So he said, can they take me out there? So I was on duty at the time, and I said, you take me. So in the afternoon, after work had finished, he drives this car. This is now the Prime Minister of Rhodesia. He drives in this rather beat-up old Alfa Romeo. His bodyguard's a driver, and Ian's just sitting next to him. He gets out. I strap him into the thing, and I fly him to his farm. And unfortunately, I told him about my dad and his business working with cattle, because all he wanted to talk about that whole flight was his Brahman cattle. So we get there, and we landed, and he went to see his wife. He saw something, and I just did a quick turnaround, jumped back in, and I flew him back here. So that was my first experience. Then after independence, now this is now 18 years after independence, I was back in Zimbabwe, and I knew someone who knew Ian Smith, and we were talking about him. I told him about the flight. He said, would you like to go see him?
What year is that? What year is that?
1998.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he's still in country then?
Yes. And everyone's got these big fences around and barbed wire and lasers and all this sort of thing. So this chap said, would you like to speak again? I said, I'd love to. He said, well, I'll organize it. So we went around and we drove up, and he did have a fence, but nothing fancy. He just opened the gate, and next door introduced himself, and the blacks next door were all saying, hello, how are you? He said, those are the Cubans, my mates. And he waves at the Cubans. That's a Cuban embassy. Oh, the world's crazy. Anyway, we went inside, and I mentioned the flight I'd taken to his farm. And believe it, I should have mentioned cattle again. So he spoke for the next hour about his Brahman cows, man. And he'd been to Texas, and I wanted to talk about politics with him. And eventually we got onto it. And a couple of things he said which really remarked. First of all, he's a man's man. He's very courageous, and he's straight as a dart. One day he was going shopping. I'd heard the story. He told me himself. He went into a town. This is now 10 years. His wife had passed away, but it is 10 years after independence. And he went into something like Walmart in Harare. And when he got inside there, the manager came up and said, Mr. Smith, there's a group of Africans outside, waiting for you. And he said, I'd suggest, because they assumed you're going to be very anti-Ian Smith. So, they wanted to do something to him. So he said, I suggest we go out the back door. He said, no, I came in the front door. I'm going out the front door. He went out there, and it was all the Africans that put him on their shoulders.
Wow.
They were sick of Mugabe by that stage. That's only 18. He got a lot worse after that. And he said, I can't get, because he lived right next to the golf course, Royal Salisbury golf course or something. He said, I can't go walking anymore because they all want to put me on their shoulders, these Africans. He told me that stage he'd spoken to every minister in Mugabe's government except Mugabe himself.
Wow.
Then he said another thing as well. He said, I've never associated myself with Mandela. He said, the only reason is Mandela's a statesman. And he said, a politician is someone who's just working towards the next election. And he said, a statesman is working towards for the next generation. And he said, Mandela is a statesman, and I don't want to tarnish his legacy, if you want to put it there. Because Mandela would have seen him. There's no doubt about it. But he just felt that would tarnish him. When he passed away, about 2007 or so, 2008, Smith, he still got everyone around the world writing a really bad thing about him, about this racist guy, except the Australians. And I have to give it to them. And they said, our new newspaper here is the Australian. They said, this guy was someone who thought he was doing the right thing for his country. He was just a farmer, and that's what he ended up. And that epitomized him. That was my feeling about him as well. He also had people on the right who didn't like what he was doing about giving independence, there was, there was in politics.
Yeah. Do you still have family there?
I've got a cousin, and we sort of, a couple of probably quite distant colors. We came from large families, so I've got cousins all over the place, I think. But one guy I keep in contact with there. Yeah. Most of my sister, they all went to South Africa. And a lot of them, But I won't go back, Greg. If the country is not the country I grew up in. I can't even take my daughter. That's why I write about it, because I can't take my children back. It's not the country I grew up. The farm I grew up in, they had to blow all the buildings up because they were using them as guerrilla bases.
Yeah. It's such a trippy thing to think that the world you grew up in is just 180 degrees different from what it was. That's wild.
Well, I've got very good farming friends in Tasmania. We lived up on the beaches, and I got very with the farmer, and where I kept my horses. We had horses in Tasmania, and I sort of not envy is probably too strong a word, but every time we see him, he's got friends who've been his friends. They've been there since 1904 or something, and he's got friends and family who come and visit him. We got none of it. I was saying to a friend of mine the other day, we got together for a barbecue here with a couple of friends of ours from way back. And I said, it's a pity we can't just go and see the blokes, some of the other guys, because they're all over the world. If you think of any in the world, it's invariably got to a head of Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have, I'm just curious, did you have any mishaps in the planes? Was there ever mechanical problems?
No. I gave a talk a while ago, and it was another guy, airline captain, gave a talk. Now, I've got 23,200 hours, okay? And I've only heard of another couple of guys who've got those sort of hours, but a lot of it's from the airline flight. This captain was standing up and talking about all the engine failures and fires he had. And I had a lot more experience than him. And I said, I've had none. Nothing. Mainly because I've been flying jets. Jets are one of this airplane to fly. It's only one moving part. Something like a Spitfire has got 27,000 moving parts or something ridiculous now. The jet just got one moving part. So, no, I've been very fortunate. One thing I did, and I explained in the book what happened, and I'll explain it again. One of the downsides about doing very well on your pilot's course, and the military pilot's course, and especially going to fighters, is that I don't remember my instructor say, I overheard him once, and he said in the office, how's it going with Murray? And he said, I just sit there and watch him, type of thing. And then my next bloke on the vampires, he was the boss. So he was more interested in the paperwork he had to do when he got home than teaching me to fly. So I was obviously flying all right. But the problem is when you finish, I think the statistics are the guys who have the most accidents after their training come from the top 10% of the course because they've never seen anything go wrong. Does that explain it? I eventually got to instruct students who are having problems. I used to say to them, you're lucky because anything mistake you make, I could show you now. But you get on the line and you've never seen these mistakes in your single engine jet. Now what? So I went up in a Vampire. It was a two-seater Vampire, but it was on my own. And I had doing a formation, which I've never done before in cloud. And it's in the book, but it was just one of those Swiss cheese days. It was below my minimum, and the boss wanted to do this formation. He wanted me to fly in formation. And I looked at the weather and I said, sir, this is below mine. He said, come on, it'll get better. It'll be all right. It'll be fine. I get in this Vampire. The Vampire's got touch points all over it. So I start the engine and it's going, whoa. And I called him up. I said, I'm not happy with this engine. So he said, are you coming or aren't you? So one little stripe here, I'm coming. So we taxied out and we formation takeoff. And virtually as we got airborne, the whole aircraft started shuddering. And I fell back. And of course, I had an engine failure, I would assume. And into the cloud, I got called up for a quick what they call a quickie GCA. It's a radar vector thing. And I don't know why, but at the corner of my eye, I could see something was on the wings. And the vampires were so old, and to get their gear up, you had to leave it down here, pull it out, and lift it up. And right next door to was a speed brake lever, which is going into detent. But they were so old, there was no detent. So as I passed the undercarriage lever, I must have hit the speed brake lever. I was also very tense at that stage as well. And of course, that was why I was going backwards. Anyway, I said I apologized. They talked me up and we met up. And in fact, then we came back for a descent through about 15,000 feet of cloud, 15,000 feet. And I was in formation with him. And I honestly, I don't know how the buttons didn't pop out of my stick because I was squeezing so hard. But as I crossed, as we broke cloud right close to the runway, basically, I could now see run and I just relaxed. And I must have had a whole lot of right pedal on to keep me away from the airplane because we're in close formation. And I relaxed and it brought the wing in. Now, we're now only about 100, probably 50 feet off the ground. And I'm slipping under this aircraft. And of course, with no power controls, there's nothing. It was just going under. And the last thing I remember was seeing this jet pipe right here, 50 feet above the ground. As I went underneath it, but as I broke obviously the wing, the controls started working as I broke through the slipstream. And I landed on the other side of the runway into the bush. Actually on the threshold, but straight into the bush. And it'd been raining, fortunately. And it slowed down very quickly, and I was able to put the power on and come out. Well, the boss, he was never an my bad friend anyway. He said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm off the runway." He said, "I can't see you." I said, "I'm on the other side." Anyway, they went back, and I stopped the runway at the end of the runway, and the boss of the base came out. And he was a lovely guy. And I got out the aircraft, and he looked up at me, and as I was standing on top of the wing, he said, "Are you right, Murray?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm okay." He said, "The airplane looks all right as well." He said, "Exactly the same thing happened to me in the Spitfire." Can you imagine? The Spitfire's got the same controls, no power controls, and obviously he did exactly the same thing. He said, "I won't say anything. You don't need to say anything. We'll go away." All they did was, because I've been a technician, all the guys knew me. They called me Farmer Murray because they had to pull this airplane and water all of the dirt off the run off the airplane. But that's honestly, I can honestly say that's the only time I've ever felt any time that things were. But and once again, because I've never seen it before, and if I've been trained and I'd had a couple of problems in formating, I might have been done a bit better, perhaps. But anyway, we're here.
What's your takeaway from all this? From all your flying?
Oh, gee. There were a couple of things there. While I was on that particular sortie? On that particular flight, you mean?
No, just in general, your whole career flying.
I guess it's just a pleasure. That's what I wrote the book, the joy of flying. Whatever the flying has been, it's just been a pure joy. And and a lot of it, particularly airline flight, to do with people. You know, it's only when I retired I met people who weren't so professional, and especially in the general aviation world, there's not that quality or that integrity, I suppose, in a way, that you get from really professional outfits, you know, at the end of the day. Yeah. The other thing as well, which you often get asked in combat as well, and this might sound a bit strange, but people have often said, "Well, weren't you frightened? You know, people shooting you," at that type of thing. You know, and I don't want to be flippant at all here. And I think other people have felt the same way. You just don't want to stuff it up. So if you're going into combat, you've got a role to do, and you don't want to let anyone down. And I can only say I never went into the sort of intense combat that they had in Vietnam and stuff like that. But still, if people are shooting at you, all the back of my mind is, I don't want to let anyone down out of this. You know, at the end of the day, you know, I don't want to stuff it up. It sounds flippant, but someone asked me the other day.
I feel like that's, you know, I'll be honest with you. The pilots that I've interviewed, both the helicopter pilot and the fighter pilots, they all kind of, I feel like that's a pretty prevalent attitude. when things are going wrong, they're not really worried about that. They're just focused on, what do I got to do to make this right? What do I got to do to get back? What do I got to do to save this other person? Or I mean, it's just very methodical, not panicking at the time, just being very staid about their situation. I'm surprised at how it's just stable the pilots are. Like, they're a little more engineer than I would imagine. You know what I'm saying? And it makes sense that the Air Force or that you got somebody that has to handle multiple situations at one time, right? Read instruments, look at the weather, gauge the weapon system. You need somebody that's pretty mellow in that sense, like mentally, to take care of all that stuff, because you can't be getting wound up over things, or that's, I would assume, when accidents happen.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of the interview process as well, Greg. They've got to pick up a character that they think will fit them all. There's something I should mention here as well, is we're probably a little bit too flippant about it at times, because people would say to me, flying for Qantas, I mean, this is the best job ever. It was just wonderful, flying around this beautiful country, these lovely people, and we land up early somewhere, and there's always a beach close by. They'd always have bicycles in the hotel for us. Go to the beach, spend the afternoon at the beach, come home. And I'd say, this is the most fantastic job, and it's better than working something. And then I did a flight into Adelaide once, and my wife was sitting between us. She was in the jump seat. And it was the plane, because the plane was full. She was coming up to Darwin with me. And the weather was foul. It was awful. And we were getting radar affected here, radar affected there, and everything. And eventually we got down and we landed without any problem at all, and we texted off, and she hit me on the arm. She said, "Don't you ever tell me that this is an easy job and that it's all fun." she did it, and she was very angry with me, because she was sitting there with her eyes wide open and listening to what was going on. And then another time I took off out of Sydney with a young flight attendant who just wanted a jump seat to go somewhere. And the same thing out of Sydney, where the winds and that weather can be really bad. Anyway, we got out, we had to do a lot of brain victory after we got to the top. And she's just a young girl. And she just said to us, "Bart," she said, "you guys work so well together, And it's and it's a young girl, but I really took a lot of out of that. She can appreciate what we're doing and how we're doing it up there. And I've only met this guy an hour ago, Greg. That's the other thing about it. You meet a guy an hour ago. I didn't fly with a lot of guys. We had 3,000 pilots or whatever it was, You flew some of the guys again. But sometimes you never knew. An hour ago, you met a guy, you worked out the weather, the fuel, you jumped in the airplane, and here you go into this filthy weather with it. And everything runs on rails. It's a great job. I mean, it's a great professional job. It really is.
My son, his best friend is a pilot, and he loves it. He's flying those Embraer, smaller, yes. The 50-person jet or whatever, 70-person jets. He loves it. He loves flying, though. He has a little bush plane that he built. Yeah. And he just loves it.
Oh, fantastic.
He loves everything about flying.
It is, and it's. I'm saying I feel quite sorry in a lot of ways for young people today, because, probably the main reason I wanted to be a pilot is I saw airplanes flying all the time. You just don't see that anymore,
Yeah.
I mentioned last time the STEM program: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. This country obviously is short of those people, and they want to encourage people. So we're professionals going to do it. And I went and spoke in Tasmania. When we lived in Tasmania, I spoke about 10 schools there, and I went to this quite a low socioeconomic area in the southwest, this old mining area. Still a really great place. I mean, they've got a lovely school, it's free and everything like that. And I spoke to the whole school. And I just started off thing with jets flying over on my program. And I said, "Does anyone know what a jet fighter is?" Sorry, before I even did that, I said, "Does anyone know what a jet fighter is?" Nothing. Does anyone see Top Gun? Not one. They've never even seen a jet there, because if any jet flies over these days, someone complains. So you just don't see jets ever, And I've changed my whole talk now. Basically, it's almost promotion. I think I've told you last time. We got the best fighters in the world here, 35 if ship order. We got the best airlines, A380, biggest in the world, 787. We're getting the A350. You can fly them because in Australia, one of the few places in the world, the bloke, the poorest guy in the back seat there has got a brain, can do that because he gets it all free. The school is free. If Qantas needs pilots, they're free. It's a cadetship. It's free. It doesn't matter how you speak. Well, we all speak the same in Australia, but in England, even the guys who live on the east side of London probably can't get a job as a British Airways pilot because India certainly can't. Because I've spoken to all these different people. Right, in South America, you're probably going to be rich or something, It's and unfortunately, because it's all here, these guys don't get to see them. So unless you grow up reading books about planes and you like planes, it's unfortunate. It's not going to change, I think, because they make too much noise. Unfortunately.
Okay, tell me about the book. You wrote the book when? What year did you write this?
During COVID, I'd been writing from the early 90s. Because I had a daughter born in Hong Kong, and she grew up in Australia. And we get a lot of overtime, so I've been writing for a long time. Stories, but a lot longer than those ones. And so I've got 2 big files full of them. But then came COVID time. We were living on the beach in Tasmania, and it wasn't a problem for us because we were isolated. It was a small hamlet, and we could go on the beach and everything. But it was my father's birthday, and he'd died 30 years before that. But he once asked me if I could come and fly my Hunter jet over the top of him on the farm where he was. Now, down in the Vampire, there was a quiet aircraft, so there was no problem. So I said, yeah, no problem. So I had this very fancy recce pod on the side, camera, amazing camera. So I found him, and I'd done my sortie, my task, and then I've climbed up and I found the farm, and they could hear me coming this around, and I dropped down to come take a photograph, but now I'm accelerating. So when I get just here, you can see my dad, you can recognize him. His hand's up there, waving at me. You can see his car, the cattle's headed down, and the farmer's looking up at me, and the Africans are looking at us. Anyway, I went over, woof, and I found my dad at night. I've got a lovely big photograph printed for me. And I said, how is it going, Dad? How was that? And he said, please never do that again. He said, spent the whole day looking for cattle, building fences again, because they knocked every fence down. The farmers were livid with me because they'd lost their own work anyway. So I just thought that was fun. And I wrote it, and I put it onto 2 Facebook pages, my own one and South African Air Force. And I think you're one of the Rhodesian ones. But the South African Air Force guy said, gee, man, haven't you got any more of those stories? But of course, after like 60 of them, and every time I've got a manuscript this side, which I've got for my daughters from their book, for people how much they enjoy them, And you hear so many bad things, Greg, about the internet and all that and bad language. I never got one negative thing at any stage saying, well, this guy's full of rubbish or whatever. They're just all positive. Every single one was positive. And then one guy, he was actually, a couple of guys kept on saying, you've got to write a book. You've got to write a book. I've been written children's books and that type of stuff. But in this particular case, anyway, there was a South African. He's actually a scientist. He's written several books. And he writes to this. And he said, here's my publisher. Get hold of him and see what he thinks. And that's where the book came out of that, So it was published by the Facebook page. And, there was a certain feeling of that. I'm now done. That sounds weird, but there was a completion after that. I'm lucky because I've got a lovely 14-year-old daughter, a lovely child. So I've got lots that I've got on my plate, and I've talked about that Mirage I'm trying to get to South Africa for my friend in Tasmania. Yeah. We're going there to go and try and work that out. I've got permission from the tax office that if we buy it, it's probably worth $1 million. And he wants a lot less for it. And the tax man doesn't care how much he paid for it. They'll just give him a rebate on what they think it's worth.
Oh, wow.
So I'm hoping my friend will actually make money out of it, if anything. Or you come out, and I don't want him to make money, but come out on top. I don't want him to be there. And he's going to make a building for our museum. And if I spend the rest of my days going and polishing that, in fact, I've written to the department here, and I said to them, I'm 78 years old, but I've got the Hunter on my license, and I'm current. I say current. I've got a medical. That's all you really need. And when I wrote to them the last time, because I looked like I was going to fly a Hunter, this is 2 years ago, I wrote to them, I said, what do I need to do to go and jump in a Hunter now? They said, go and get with a flight instructor in a 172, Cessna 172, and if you keep the wings level, you go get a new Hunter. That's why I had to go to Canada, because Canada doesn't do that. They want a qualified Hunter pilot on the right-hand seat. Anyway, so I'm just written to the department down, said, this thing can be made flyable. I don't know if we've got the resources to do that, but I've just written to them and said, what do I need to do to get the summer license? I've got the Hunter, my civvy license. They're not doing Mirage. They're not doing civilian Mirage pilots around anymore. So current, well, not current. So we never know. That
would be cool to get that going, huh?
Yeah, they'll have to come across, huh? Give me
I will. Ironically, you'd say that about the 747, but it was before 9/11 happened. I was doing a job filming a commercial in Australia, in Sydney, and I was flying over there with the producer, and we were in that upper deck, behind where the pilots were, and they were over the ocean. Everyone had fallen asleep, and the door opened up, and they came and they said, "Hey, do you want to come? You want to come sit in the cockpit?" And not sit, but just come look in there. Yeah, and sure. We sat in there for 10 minutes, and that was so freaking cool. That was so amazing. Seeing the ocean, way below, and those guys were so cool flying that plane. So,
well, I did the flying around Australia from 1990 to 21 years. And while we could, when I was, if I was going into Sydney, for example, and coming over that harbour, there's nothing like that in the world. I used to always make sure I said to them, just go and ask one of those business class, first class passengers if they want to come and sit up there, because there's nothing like it. It's a lovely part of it. It's a place to sit.
Yeah.
Especially going, yeah. And also, I always feel I never have to go and see the Antarctic again. When I was with my wife, Cindy, she was in South Africa. Now, I said I courted her first class because we got together. I gave her a horse when she was 9 years old. But we didn't see each other for 35 years. And when we met up again, we were both on our own. We got chatting. And so I used to go across without days off. I could go first class across to and the one time we were going to South Africa, and the winds are so strong here, the jet stream here, that in order to get out of the wind, they fly down over Hobart, Tasmania, down to Antarctica, to 70 south, and then fly up. Yeah, you get out because the wind's up to 200 knots. So anyway, I got up in the middle of the night, just go to the loo, and there's a flight on first class. So the flight attendant's looking out the window in the galley, and I said, "Oh, what you looking at there?" She said, "Oh, there's Antarctica." We can sure enough, there's Antarctica, icebergs and everything.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, so that is cool. Yeah, but just imagine that to take that much time to go that far south and then come up to Joburg. Yeah, I've got to say that. Then the opportunity, I really wanted to come to this country, and the opportunity came up, and it was, I really think, from all aspects, mainly from the people, for everything, it was the best job I had. I mean, and I'm still friends with I'm always a healthy disrespect for authority. I'm a good Irishman. But I've just found in Australia, the bosses were my friends. I'm still friendly with my training manager. He's a lovely guy, He loves his airplanes still. So
how many years did you fly for them?
21 years, yeah.
Wow.
Which 20 were come on, as a captain and the check and training captain for 9 years. So, and it was just a great company. And I did an interview one of my children's books. I was in had a display once, an exhibition, and the interviewer, the radio, said to me, "What do you like about? Well, what do you really like about Australia?" And it was dreamy because there's so many aspects of it, and I just said the people. There's such a positive attitude. Chili right, mate. Give them a fair go.
That's very
good
true.
on you, mate. Everything's positive, and it's so easy. Everything, and no one ever called me. If the brand new flight attendant would come up, they would say, "This is Steve, not Captain Steve." They knew you are Captain. I never had any disrespect ever shown to me. And they had the confidence if something was going wrong out there, they could call up and say, "Listen, Steve, we've got an engine fire, we've got this going on." And it happened to me at times. Where they got the confidence, where a lot of airlines don't have that confidence because the captain is God. and they're petrified of the bloke. And because we got this level, we never killed a person in encounters. Because you got this level playing field, and it came up in one of our discussions once when I was training. A lot of airlines around the world, the gradients like this, the captain's up here and the rest of them are down there. Whereas this bloke here, we be like this. If he's not happy with something, he'll happily say so. Wow. And I actually, when I became a trade cap, I took that on. When I trained guys, first officers, I said, listen, in a lot of ways, you're probably quicker than this guy now because you're younger than him. Don't take everything that he says as gospel. Do it in the most respectful way. But make sure. And I've had a couple of captains come up and say, "What you showed him?" I said, "No." So what do you see? I said, "No, I did it deliberately, because it keeps the balance along the way, as long as done respectfully." Anyway, I just wanted to say
that's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. There was an English guy who came back. Everyone thinks, we haven't got mountains, or we haven't got mountains, but we got howling winds here. So everyone thinks it's safe because of the terrain. It's not. It's because of the way the guys fly here. The whole, even like I remember listening to a guy about a huge fire here. You got a fire chief and all these young guys running around. And one young guy says, the fire chief says, "We all go and do that." And the young guy says, "I don't think we should." And the fire chief sits back and says, "Why?" He said, "Because, okay, that sounds really reasonable to me." They have these huge exercises up in Darwin there with people from Malaysia and everywhere. And they have these generals in Red Force and Blue Force. And up comes, I remember one guy telling me, when there was Australians to it, they did the formation, whatever it was. So they sent up a flight lieutenant, the captain. And the wing commander was on the side here. So they said, the general, the colonels and the other airlines said, "What's he doing here?" He said, "He's their best pilot. He's been here the longest. He's got the most experience." They just respect, your abilities, basically, at the end of the day. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I found my experience in Australia was awesome. That's what I really remember is the people. They were fun to work with. They were a lot of fun.
They will niggle you as long as you give it back. I found that as well.
Yes.
They tease my accent and whatnot, but as long as you give it back, they're happy.
Yeah,
it's
true.
An old Irish thing, I think. It's an old Irish thing. This country, I've read a lot of history about this country, and I have to think that the Irish are people who made it all good in a way. Because in the early days in settlement, and this is probably going off what you wanted to talk about, but reading about the early settlement here with the convicts and the British Army who ran the place, when the convicts started getting their ticket of leave, where they became free, they were petty convicts, a lot of them, most of them probably. But anyway, when they got their ticket of leave to become free, the army, the elite of the English in Sydney wouldn't let them join because they wanted to keep this separation between the convicts class and the other class. But in the middle of all this, they had Irish convicts, and the Irish convicts were just seditionists. You got your architects, your lawyers, and they just didn't like English people. So they weren't your real convicts, if you want to call it. They were educated elitists. So in amongst all that, bringing that into this whole mix type of thing, brought all the Australians together. The thing of what I've got here, when I've brought up servants all my life, and everywhere I've lived, there's been servants. There are never servants here, Greg. They might have a lady come and clean your house or something like that. I think the richest woman, one of the richest women in the world here, she's worth $20, I don't know how many $billion, whatever it is here. I doubt if she's got a servant. She'll just have someone clean the house. It's just, they just feel them. It's very egalitarian, if I can put it that way, which you probably expect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're just still not there because I've got to give the Aussies a play.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. Thanks for coming on today.